I'm an architect, of course, and so that enables me to be today extremely literal about the question of size, because size is our profession. I want to go back a little bit in time and look at the situation in the world in '89. The world was very divided between political systems, and of course the wall fell, and we thought at some point, or many people thought, that the world would kind of finally become kind of identical and that our values would be triumphant. As part of that euphoria, because there was a euphoric dimension to it, I wrote a book, and that book was actually a kind of recognition of the value of, and the inherent properties of different scales, small, medium, large, extra large. And in that book I wrote bigness, which was supposed to be a kind of theory of what at this moment where globalization was being launched, and where you had a sense that globalization could actually achieve something major and something new, and that newness would be about bigger scale and perhaps also bigger and deeper complexities. So bigness was an attempt to approach that dimension. The building we did for CCTV is in a way a prototype of what bigness could achieve. And one of the interesting things about it is not an icon or not kind of really building, but it is partly architecture, but for a very large extent it's also simply a machine. Many sections of it are kind of robotized, and I would say that kind of maybe 60% of the building is technological spaces. And I think that hybrid, or that connection between the formerly humanistic dimension of architecture with the kind of currently crucial technological sphere, was one of the original part of the building. What we didn't realize at the time, of course, is that unbeknown to us, we in the early 90s had surrendered to the market economy, and that kind of more and more the market economy was partly undermining but also partly dictating what we were actually doing and what we were able to do. And I would say that kind of an important effect of the market economy has been to shift the issue of challenge toward the issue of comfort. I'm part of a generation that, almost to a caricature extent, was interested in challenging, and I'm now confronted with a generation that, to an equally caricature extent, is interested in comfort. This was, and I think that kind of shift has had kind of very crucial different impact on both architecture and art. I think that in this picture you see a man, and he is facing a city, and you know that in the next 12 hours or even there will be some kind of adventurous event, and more importantly maybe a totally unpredictable event. This is the current mail, and you know that kind of even in the next 48 hours there will be no adventurous event, and that he's entering a kind of really safe situation, and that situation doesn't contain any surprises, and that it is entirely the effect of his own, the result or the outcome of his own desires. This was the kind of art of my generation. This is the kind of art of the kind of current generation. Here, kind of challenging, angry man, creating obstacles, and here a seductive and beautiful object, creating pleasure and greater, a lot greater crowds. So this. The market economy, I think, has been the main driver, whatever we hear in terms of cultural motivations. I think that the market economy has been the main driver of museum extensions. Museums became kind of bigger and bigger. And in this diagram, you see that the kind of museum extensions are almost exactly following the market economy and the kind of values of Wall Street. And I think that is, in retrospect, a kind of really appalling coincidence that kind of somehow all of us have to live down. Of course, these extensions were never presented as commercially driven or driven by the liberal system. On the contrary, we had kind of preachers that preached in the name of artists even a kind of very sober and kind of neutral environment that supposedly was the most ideal condition to show art. Here we have one of them. And I think that this emphasis on neutrality has been actually extremely unfair to artists, because it created an art that needed to kind of fill and justify the enormity of these spaces, that could only be done in a way that was overwhelming, and I would say triumphalist, and in a scale that can only be appreciated almost from a kind of adoring kind of position, as of course was very much the case in Olafur's project. I want to kind of really show my sadness about this kind of state of affairs in these two pictures. This is the Grand Palais in Paris. It is in the beginning of the 20th century. You see a balloon, but you see that the ground is covered with inventions, with creativity, with innovation. And you see 100 years later, the same balloon, but the balloon has grown to absurd proportions, and the ground is empty, and there is an audience intimidated by size of a crazy dimension. Architecture was definitely not immune to this whole kind of situation, also participated eagerly to the extent that if this was architecture before expressing common values, expressing the best in a given world, this is architecture now, and you see both the scale is again overwhelming. It is also a kind of scale that you can only adore and not reject. And the collective production of architects in the world these days has been, I would say, kind of more driven by, again, what the economy asks us to do, rather than our individual geniuses. And of course, it is, if you put the architecture together, kind of quite a sad spectacle. We were involved in an endless amount of competitions. We designed up to 2005 34 soccer fields worth of art museum. We didn't win any of them, and that was kind of partly because we actually really introduced ambitions that were not kind of did not register at that time of the kind of value world of the art world. Here, for instance, we proposed that digital techniques could be used in the new Museum of Modern Art by creating kind of individual visits where a person could specify a sequence of paintings that he or she would want to see in a given kind of period, and would then be able, beyond curatorial control, to have that kind of private experience. And that infuriated MoMA so much that our chances were gone. This is a kind of museum, an extension we did for the kind of Whitney, where actually we used the issue of size very precisely by kind of suggesting that in a number of brownstones that Whitney owned, we would create intimate and personal experiences, where in the Boyer building, which had been kind of responsible for a growth spurt of American art in the 50s and 60s, we would basically contain that art, and where we would create spaces for new media and others elsewhere. So basically it was a kind of composition between brownstone, Boyer, and new architecture, which very precisely allocated certain kind of paintings to kind of certain size. I would say that the outcome, and perhaps the best outcome of bigness, because I'm still not entirely ready to kind of reject the whole concept, and I think that also we should, although we should be critical of this constant extension, I think that there is also a moment that this extension can produce something very interesting. And I would say that that would be the moment where bigness leads to museums that are themselves almost like cities. That the scale becomes so big that you can only inhabit it on the kind of urban level and with urban strategies, and no longer kind of with the precision and elegance of an individual institution, but that you have to kind of assemble institutions and components in an urban way, and also therefore create the unsimilar or dissimilar speeds and tempos of different components. In other words, it should be an architecture that should not be persistent or eternal. This is a project we did for Beijing, Museum of Modern Art, where actually the outside was a typical urban perimeter that went inside, and where commercial, academic and other institutions were simply kind of mixed in this kind of large entity with a kind of exhibition machine. Exhibitions are very short in China, with a kind of exhibition machine on top. So I think there is a dimension of bigness which still could actually be part of an innovative strategy to kind of reinvent the museum, but it's by partly abandoning its character and its current definition. I became kind of slightly worried about this whole world in a kind of visit in Petersburg with Tom Krantz. Tom Krantz, the thinker behind many of the kind of extensions, and that visit was together with Frank Gehry. Petersburg, the Hermitage, is actually not a single building, but a whole constellation of buildings, an enormous amount of rooms. And the Hermitage itself already contained 1,200 rooms, and a new building was being added to it, and of 800 new rooms. So the issue of the Hermitage was, how can a museum inhabit 2,000 rooms? And so therefore inevitably an issue of bigness, and in my view also inevitably a kind of model of the museum as a city or as a large part of a city. Now, when we were here, Krantz and Gehry felt that there was something missing from those 2,000 rooms, and that was space big enough to accommodate American art. That for me was a kind of moment of kind of really bifurcation, where I could no longer, in good loyalty, pursue the same aims, and where I started kind of thinking of other kind of strategies. Maybe something would work if, for instance, the 800 new rooms of that building would be used to include in every room a kind of single work of art, or a single statement, or a single piece of the archive. And so I began to kind of really think about kind of more subtle and less expansionist and scale-obsessed dimensions. So we also kind of started to explore possibilities of museums in unconventional places. This was a kind of new reconstructed neighborhood in Guangzhou. We proposed a museum here in the almost agricultural fields, proposed a special elevator for that museum, and we bought an apartment for an artist in residence, so that the new museum was completely contained and ingrained in existing architecture without any claim for new uniqueness, any claim of separate identity, but really ingrained in that neighborhood, and became, with Huang Ru as the main thinker behind it, a kind of very important part of the art world in China. Another strategy that I began to embrace is to do things that are not so much beyond identity, but I was looking to shed my obvious identity by beginning to renovate existing buildings, and by looking at preservation as a kind of potential territory that you could, where you could overcome the kind of iconographic obligations of the current age. So one important building we did recently was to renovate Russian Soviet restaurant in Moscow, completely fallen in disrepair, but still, like any Soviet architecture, in terms of its dimensions, extremely generous and welcoming, and with proportions that anyway in the current economic system would never be affordable. So what we did, we took this ruin, we decided to wrap it in layers of plastic. It was in a kind of very beautiful park, so it would be beautiful to see kind of through this plastic the kind of outside. And simply that gesture, which was highly impersonal, was enough to create a building on the basis completely of this kind of Soviet thinking that was generous and popular. We also convinced, and this would be very difficult, I think, to do anywhere in Europe, that the damage of this restaurant would be kind of part of the displays and would even kind of form a background of new exhibitions on the theory that kind of somehow this damaged kind of situation would make and let's say reduce the intimidation that people still in certain museums experience. What I think is also extremely important, and where kind of mostly our current almost contempt for other cultures than our own stops us from imagining kind of new institutional arrangements. This is a kind of proposal for how a unique situation could be used for kind of renovating a tired model of the museum. We were the planners of the kind of airport in Qatar, and we were also the planners of a kind of city next to the airport that would have a kind of border or an interface of 5 kilometers between airport and city. And that allowed us then to imagine that you could have an institution on that interface which would have a kind of presence at the airport and also a presence in the city, which could be an enormous collector of all the initiatives that were necessary, all the educational obligations that were necessary, but also all the commercial incentives that could exist in the Middle East at the kind of current moment. So we called it, it would be an institution where you would have banking, archiving, art handling, advising, film, fine art, but also antiques and jewelry, and also collections of cars, all the kind of elements that really make us shiver with kind of potential of bad taste, all together in a kind of situation where part of the building would be public, part of the building would be kind of private, or almost like a part of tax-free zone, and where you could kind of shift between the two, and where at some points elements of the airport could become public. Five more minutes. Okay, and such an institution could, in a way, kind of settle all the complications that are currently in Qatar of double museums, museums that double all facilities, and create a kind of new economy. Okay, very briefly, I'm kind of working on the Stedelijk Museum, and I think this is also a strategy which is kind of rarely kind of used, a strategy of having a new building, but then seeing what could be done in terms of the museum's history and how the new part of the building could actually achieve more than simply being an extension. The Stedelijk Museum is the old one has a series of big, small and big rooms. The new Stedelijk Museum has a kind of huge room the obvious way of collecting it would be temporary exhibitions in the new and old exhibitions in the old. What I think is very exciting is that Stedelijk has decided to really reverse that logic and to use the old building for temporary exhibitions and to therefore use the new buildings for collections. We started by kind of thinking of highlights, or the Stedelijk started thinking of highlights, but I think that in the meantime something much more subtle has kind of emerged in terms of an ambition to not so much highlights, but to create groups or clusters of works in the collection in a way that where the different media illuminate each other, and where therefore this kind of radical separation is eliminated, and where you can get a kind of more contextual environment. Here, the relations, the works, and several steps. Initially, we thought we would define those clusters by light, but now we have walls of steel that we are kind of experimenting with, and that kind of in a couple of months will be the new Stedelijk collection. I want to end again on the level of bigness with kind of an issue that Benjamin also kind of raised, and which I've been kind of fascinated with. Benjamin already mentioned that many of current preoccupations and effects are much more visible in the countryside than in the cities. We have been looking at the countryside worldwide and continue to do that. And I'm deeply fascinated by a place called Reno Tahoe Industrial City, an incredibly beautiful landscape, where an enormous amount of colossal buildings is emerging in a way which seems largely unplanned, and where the scale of buildings themselves becomes extreme and at a scale that the world has never before seen. Now, what I think is fascinating is that kind of because these buildings are not inhabited in the classical way, they are largely machines and robotized. Certain elements that have completely disappeared from architecture, like colors or like intensities, or we live in a kind of world of beige. These are buildings without beige. And there is therefore a kind of visual excitement to be experienced, and a very strange status to the human occupant, who is mostly kind of security agent, who has to, but who is also kind of has to be very careful with his movement in a building, and who has a kind of human remnant, or a remnant of humanism, kind of minor pockets in the buildings that are working for him. Old style humanism. Here, and that artificiality is going further, for instance, in certain buildings that are now excluding large parts of the of the spectrum, so that you see entities like this, which, in my view, architecture should embrace or should try to define a relationship with. Because these are much more radical experiences than architecture has been able to generate for a very long time. And so therefore, basically, I think there's a huge challenge, but also a very exciting challenge to find and establish this relationship. Thank you.